On January 8, 1945, at precisely 14:30 hours, Technical Sergeant Russell Dunham found himself positioned at the base of Hill 616 near Kaisersberg, France. The scene before him was dire, as German machine gun fire carved through the winter sky above his pinned-down platoon. At 24 years of age, having survived 3 campaigns, he had no intention of meeting his end that day. The challenging terrain presented a formidable obstacle, with snow accumulating to knee-deep levels throughout the area. The German forces had established a dominant tactical position by placing 3 MG-42 machine guns within fortified timber emplacements ascending the snow-covered slope. These weapons possessed devastating firepower, each capable of discharging 1,200 rounds per minute. Dunham's platoon had been advancing through the Alsace-Lorraine region when they inadvertently entered what military strategists would describe as a killing zone. Machine gun fire cascaded down from the elevated positions, while artillery shells detonated behind their lines. The only viable direction for movement appeared to be directly upward along a 40-degree slope into converging fields of fire. The week had already exacted a terrible toll, with 11 men from 2nd Platoon having been killed. The snow surrounding their position had been stained red from the bloodshed. Every soldier serving in Company I understood the sobering statistics all too well. During the Vosges Mountains campaign, the 3rd Infantry Division had sustained higher daily casualties than any other American division operating in the European theater. The German forces maintained the strategic advantage of elevated terrain, providing them with unobstructed sight lines and adequate ammunition reserves. Dunham carefully assessed the situation confronting Hill 616. His platoon remained 35 yards behind his position, pressed flat against the snow-covered ground, unable to advance or retreat. Should they remain pinned in their current location, German artillery would inevitably bracket their position and eliminate them all. Attempting to retreat would result in them being cut down in the open terrain. The machine gun positions had effectively immobilized them. Environmental conditions were equally harsh, with temperatures measuring 12 degrees Fahrenheit and snow depth reaching 18 inches. Dunham wore the standard olive-drab wool uniform, which made him a conspicuous dark target against the white landscape. Every previous soldier who had attempted movement had been immediately spotted and forced to return to cover. The Germans maintained complete control of that hill. Dunham crawled back to the company position and located a white mattress cover. He tore it open and draped it over his uniform like a makeshift robe. He then began the methodical process of loading ammunition and equipment. He stuffed 12 30-round carbine magazines into every available pocket and loop on his uniform. He secured a dozen Mark II fragmentation grenades onto his belt, hooking additional grenades through his suspenders and jamming others into the buttonholes of his field jacket. When he stood upright, he was carrying 72 pounds of ammunition and explosives in addition to his rifle. His platoon sergeant observed him without comment. Dunham offered no explanation and simply began crawling up the hill. The first 75 yards of his advance consumed 18 minutes. He moved during brief intervals when German fire shifted to other sectors, pressing himself flat against the ground when the MG-42 machine guns swept back across his approach route. The snow gradually soaked through his mattress cover. His hands became numb from the cold. The rifle sling cut into his shoulder from the weight of the grenades. At 75 yards distance, he positioned himself 10 yards from the first machine gun emplacement. The timber bunker had been reinforced with logs and strategically positioned to provide interlocking fire with the other 2 positions. 3 German soldiers manned the weapon, with one feeding the ammunition belt, another operating the trigger, and the 3rd scanning for potential targets. Dunham rose to his feet and initiated his charge. The Germans detected the movement immediately. The machine gunner swung the barrel toward him. At 6 yards distance, the weapon opened fire, Rounds tore through Dunham's white robe. A rifle bullet then struck him across the back, carving a 10-inch gash extending from his left shoulder blade to his spine. The impact spun him completely around and threw him 15 yards back down the hill into the snow. He landed face down as blood poured from the wound, soaking through the mattress cover and staining the white fabric bright red against the snow. The pain was excruciating, and he could feel the wound pulling open with every breath. For 5 seconds, he remained motionless. Then a German egg grenade landed in the snow 2 feet from his head. Dunham kicked the explosive device away with his boot. It detonated 5 yards down the slope, close enough that the concussion lifted him off the ground. Despite this, Russell Dunham rose back to his feet. He came up the hill while maintaining fire. His M1 carbine still contained 28 rounds. The German machine gunner attempted to swing the MG-42 back toward him, but Dunham had already positioned himself inside the weapon's minimum traverse arc. At 4 yards distance, he fired a 3-round burst into the gunner's chest. The assistant gunner reached for his rifle, and Dunham shot him twice. Both German soldiers fell. The third crew member, responsible for feeding ammunition, raised his hands and began shouting in German. Dunham's carbine had been emptied with 30 rounds expended in 18 seconds. He slung the rifle, grabbed the German soldier by the collar of his field gray coat, and hauled him out of the timber emplacement before shoving him down the hill toward the American lines. The German soldier half ran and half fell through the snow. Dunham's platoon would take him for interrogation. Blood was now running down Dunham's back in steady streams. The bullet wound had torn through muscle and tissue, but had missed his spine by less than 2 inches. Every movement pulled the gash wider. The white mattress cover had become saturated with blood from his shoulders to his waist. Against the snow, his appearance resembled that of a flag. The second machine gun position was located 50 yards uphill and to the right. The Germans manning that weapon had witnessed Dunham's assault on the first nest and knew he would be approaching their position. They had adjusted their field of fire to cover the approach route. Dunham could observe the timber logs of their emplacement and the dark shape of the barrel tracking across the slope. He reloaded the carbine with a fresh 30-round magazine. 11 magazines remained available, along with 10 grenades. As he began moving, the Germans opened fire at 40 yards distance. Rounds snapped past his head and kicked up geysers of snow around his boots. Dunham went down and resumed crawling. The pain in his back had become so intense that he needed to stop every few yards to prevent losing consciousness. He could feel blood pooling inside his uniform. His hands were shaking from blood loss and cold, but he continued crawling. At 25 yards from the second emplacement, he rose to one knee and removed 2 Mark II grenades from his belt. He pulled both pins, counted 2 seconds, and hurled them in a high arc toward the timber bunker. The Germans observed the incoming grenades, and one of them screamed. Both grenades detonated inside the emplacement within half a second of each other. The combined blast threw logs and equipment out of the position. The machine gun fell silent. Dunham moved forward with the carbine raised. Smoke poured from the shattered emplacement, and he could see casualties in the snow. The entire 3-man crew had been killed by the grenades. He did not stop but turned his attention down the slope to the supporting riflemen who had been positioned in foxholes around the machine gun position. 6 German infantry soldiers were scrambling out of their holes, attempting to escape. Dunham fired into them from 15 yards distance, going through another full magazine and shooting at every shape that moved. He hit 3 of them. The others broke formation and ran up the hill away from the American advance. Dunham allowed them to flee. He had one remaining target. The third machine gun position was positioned 65 yards further up the slope. It occupied the highest position, providing the best field of fire over the entire American advance. The Germans stationed there had been observing Dunham's assault for the previous 12 minutes. They knew his exact location, were aware that he was wounded, and could see that his white coat was now blood red and visible against the snow from 200 yards distance. They had him in their sights. Dunham looked up the hill and saw the barrel of the MG-42 aimed directly at him. Rifle grenades began exploding in the snow 10 yards from his position. The concussions knocked him sideways. He hit the ground as machine gun fire tore through the air where he had been standing moments before. He was completely exposed in the open with no cover available. The blood trail behind him in the snow resembled a road. The Germans positioned on top of the hill were not going to miss their next opportunity. Dunham resumed crawling. The third machine gun position had been dug into a cluster of timber 40 yards ahead and 30 feet higher in elevation. The Germans had reinforced it with sandbags and positioned it to cover the entire southern approach to Hill 616. Every few seconds, the MG-42 would fire a burst, walking rounds across the snow while searching for him. He moved during the gaps between bursts, advancing 5 yards before stopping to wait for the gun to traverse, then moving 3 more yards. The snow was so cold it burned his hands. The wound in his back had progressed from sharp pain to a deep, grinding ache that radiated through his entire torso. He had lost sufficient blood that his vision was beginning to tunnel at the edges, but he still possessed 9 magazines and 8 grenades. At 40 yards from the third position, a rifle grenade exploded 6 yards to his left. The blast threw snow and frozen dirt across his back, and the impact from the shrapnel felt comparable to being kicked by a horse. He was uncertain whether he had been hit again, as he could no longer distinguish individual sources of pain. Everything hurt. He continued crawling. At 30 yards, then 25 yards, the machine gun fire was becoming more accurate. The Germans could now see him clearly even against the snow. The blood had soaked through the entire mattress cover, and he was leaving a red trail that pointed directly to his position like an arrow. At 20 yards, then 15 yards. At 15 yards distance, Dunham stopped crawling and gathered his legs beneath him. He needed to time this action perfectly. The MG-42 fired in bursts of 8 to 12 rounds, then paused for 2 to 3 seconds while the gunner readjusted his aim. Dunham counted the pattern. After the third burst, he lunged to his feet and staggered forward. The Germans saw him immediately, and the machine gunner swung the barrel, but Dunham was already in motion, already pulling grenades from his belt. He held 2 Mark II grenades in his hands with pins pulled. At 10 yards distance, he threw them both. The first grenade struck the sandbags and bounced into the emplacement. The second went through the narrow firing slit. Dunham dove flat as both grenades detonated. The blast was massive, with sandbags flying apart and timber logs cracking and splintering. The machine gun barrel was blown sideways off its mount. Dunham pushed himself up as smoke poured from the shattered position. He moved forward with his carbine raised, scanning for movement. All 3 crew members were down. One was still moving, attempting to reach for a rifle. Dunham shot him once, and the German stopped moving. He then heard boots crunching in snow behind him. Dunham spun around to find a German rifleman who had emerged from one of the support foxholes approximately 20 feet away. The German raised his Carabiner 98 rifle and fired at point-blank range. The bullet missed Dunham's head by 3 inches. Dunham returned fire, with his first round hitting the German in the throat and his second hitting center mass. The German fell backward into the snow and did not move. Dunham stood on the hilltop, breathing hard. His carbine was empty again. He had fired 175 rounds and thrown 11 grenades. 3 machine gun positions had been destroyed. 9 Germans were dead, 7 more were wounded, and 2 had been taken prisoner. His platoon was no longer pinned down. Below him, he could observe Company I advancing up the slope. His brother Ralph was among them, moving with second squad. The Germans were falling back to secondary positions further up the ridge. The attack was succeeding. Hill 616 would be in American hands by nightfall. Dunham looked down at his uniform. The white mattress cover was completely red, saturated with blood from the neck down to his knees. He could feel the wound in his back pulling apart with every breath. The pain was so intense he could not think clearly. His hands were shaking uncontrollably from shock and blood loss, but he had accomplished his objective. 120 soldiers from Company I had been pinned in that valley. Without his assault, they would have been slaughtered by artillery within the hour. Now they were moving forward, engaging the enemy, and had a chance to succeed. Dunham sat down in the snow and waited for the medics to reach him. He did not believe he was going to die that day. The medics reached Dunham 8 minutes after he sat down. They cut away the blood-soaked mattress cover and opened his field jacket to assess the wound. The bullet had carved a gash 10 inches long and 2 inches deep across his back, running from his left shoulder blade down toward his spine. The medics could see muscle tissue and exposed bone. They packed the wound with sulfa powder and wrapped it with compression bandages before administering a shot of morphine and tagging him for evacuation. Dunham refused to leave and walked back down the hill with Company I while carrying his empty carbine. By the time they reached the battalion aid station at 1800 hours, he had lost enough blood that he collapsed at the entrance. The battalion surgeon examined him and immediately ordered him to the rear for surgery. The wound required stitches, debridement, and at least 2 weeks of recovery before he could return to combat operations. Dunham spent 4 days at the division clearing station, where surgeons cleaned the wound and closed it with 43 stitches. They informed him that the bullet had missed his spinal cord by less than 2 inches. Had the angle been slightly different, he would have been paralyzed from the waist down. Had the gash been 1 inch deeper, it would have severed his spine completely. The wound was clean, with no major nerve damage and no infection. He would heal. On January 13th, 5 days after the assault on Hill 616, Dunham was released from the clearing station and sent to a rest area 20 miles behind the front lines. The 3rd Infantry Division had been fighting continuously since landing in southern France in August 1944. The division had pushed through the Vosges Mountains, fought through Strasbourg, and was now engaged in Operation Nordwind, the last major German offensive on the Western Front. The casualties had been catastrophic. In December alone, the division had lost 863 men killed and 3,200 wounded. Every rifle company was operating at 60% strength. The replacement pipeline could not keep pace with the losses. Men were being pushed back into combat before their wounds fully healed because there was nobody else to fill the line. Dunham's wound was still seeping through the bandages. The stitches pulled every time he moved. The doctors had told him he needed 3 more weeks of recovery before returning to duty. However, on January 18th, 10 days after Hill 616, he walked into Company I command post and reported for duty. His wound was not healed, and the stitches were still in place, but 2nd Platoon was down to 18 men, and they needed every rifle they could get. The company commander reviewed Dunham's medical file, looked at Dunham, and assigned him back to his squad without questions. They were moving north to Holtzwihr, a small town 15 miles from the German border. Intelligence reported heavy German armor in the area. Panzer units from the 19th Army had been held back during Operation Nordwind and were now being committed to cut off the American salient pushing toward the Rhine. The panzers advanced from the west in a staggered line across the open farmland. The Tigers moved up from the south, their 88mm guns already traversing to engage any targets that showed movement. Company I's position was indefensible. They held a cluster of farm buildings on the southern edge of Holtzwihr with no cover, no concealment, and no way to stop 70-ton tanks with frontal armor 8 inches thick. The bazooka teams fired their rockets at maximum range. 2 rockets hit their targets, but both bounced off the Panther's glasses plate without penetrating. The Germans didn't even slow down. At 0630 hours, the company commander gave the order to surrender. White flags went up from 3 buildings. The German tanks stopped advancing, and infantry moved forward to take prisoners. 147 men from Company I walked out with their hands up. The Germans disarmed them, searched them, and formed them into columns for transport to prisoner-of-war camps in the rear. Dunham did not surrender. He slipped out the back of the farmhouse while the Germans were processing prisoners and ran west through a line of bare trees toward a cluster of outbuildings 200 yards away. His back wound had reopened during the night, and he could feel blood seeping through the bandages under his uniform, but he was not going to spend the rest of the war in a prisoner camp. He reached the outbuildings without being spotted. There were 3 structures, consisting of a small barn, a tool shed, and a stone storage building with a wooden door hanging off its hinges. Dunham checked the barn first, finding it empty except for rotting hay. The shed contained nothing but broken farm equipment. The storage building contained barrels. 6 wooden barrels stood against the far wall, each approximately 4 feet tall and 3 feet in diameter. Dunham lifted the lid off the first barrel and found potatoes frozen solid. The second barrel was empty. The third barrel contained sauerkraut. The fermented cabbage filled the barrel to within 6 inches of the top, and the smell was overwhelming, acidic, and strong enough to water his eyes. Dunham looked back toward the farmhouse. German soldiers were moving through the area, checking buildings and searching for stragglers. He could hear voices shouting in German and boots crunching on frozen ground. They would arrive in minutes. He climbed into the sauerkraut barrel. The cabbage was cold and slimy and packed tight enough that he had to force his way down into it. He sank up to his chest, then his neck, then pulled the wooden lid over his head and settled into the fermented mass. The smell was suffocating. The brine soaked through his uniform and into the open wound on his back. The sting was excruciating, comparable to acid being poured directly into raw tissue. He bit down on his tongue to prevent himself from screaming. He could hear the Germans entering the storage building, with boots on the stone floor, and voices discussing something in rapid German, along with the sound of barrels being kicked and lids being lifted. They were checking every container. Dunham held his breath and pressed himself deeper into the sauerkraut. The lid above him remained closed. The Germans moved through the building, checked the other barrels, and left. Dunham stayed in the barrel without moving and barely breathing. The temperature was dropping as night approached, and he had no idea if the Germans would return. Dunham spent 13 hours in the sauerkraut barrel. The temperature dropped to 8 degrees Fahrenheit after sunset. The brine froze into slush around his body. He could not feel his hands or feet. The wound on his back had gone numb from the cold and the acidic burn of the fermented cabbage. Every hour he would shift his weight slightly to keep blood flowing, but the movement sent fresh waves of brine into the gash across his spine. At 0700 hours on January 23rd, the sun came up. Dunham could see thin strips of light through gaps in the wooden barrel lid. He listened carefully. There were no voices, no engine noise, and no boots on frozen ground. The Germans had moved on. He waited another 30 minutes to be certain, then slowly pushed the lid off and climbed out of the barrel. His uniform was soaked through with sauerkraut brine and frozen stiff. His fingers were white from frostbite. The bandages on his back had dissolved completely, leaving the wound exposed. He could smell the sauerkraut on himself from 10 feet away, but he was alive and free. He moved to the door of the storage building and looked out. The farmyard was empty. The German tanks had pulled back during the night. Company I's position was abandoned, except for equipment the Germans had not bothered to collect. Dunham could see American helmets and rifles scattered in the dirt. He needed to move and get back to American lines before the Germans returned. However, first he needed to relieve himself, as 13 hours in a barrel without moving had left him in agony. He stepped out of the storage building, moved around the corner to the side of the barn, and relieved himself against the stone wall. At that moment, 2 German soldiers appeared. They came around the opposite corner of the barn at a walking pace, talking to each other in low voices. They saw Dunham immediately, and both raised their rifles while shouting in German. Dunham raised his hands. He had no weapon visible, as his carbine was still in the sauerkraut barrel. He was soaking wet, covered in fermented cabbage, and obviously unarmed. The Germans approached carefully, with the first soldier keeping his rifle trained on Dunham, while the second moved forward to search him. The German patted down his field jacket, checking pockets, and found a pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes in Dunham's left breast pocket, holding them up for the other German to see. The other German immediately lowered his rifle and reached for the cigarettes. Both soldiers started arguing, with the first one who had found them claiming ownership, and the second one saying they should split them. They argued for 30 seconds, with both focused entirely on the cigarettes. Neither one finished searching Dunham. Neither one checked his right side. Neither one noticed his Colt M1911 pistol in a leather shoulder holster tucked under his right arm beneath his field jacket. The Germans finally agreed to share the cigarettes, split the pack, and gestured for Dunham to start walking. They marched him back to the main road where a German Kubelwagen sat idling with its driver waiting behind the wheel. The 2 soldiers put the vehicle in gear and headed east toward German lines. Dunham sat between his captors with his hands on his knees and said nothing. They drove for 40 minutes through frozen farmland and small villages. At 1100 hours, the driver pulled off the main road and stopped in front of a stone chateau that had been converted into a German command post. The driver said something in German and climbed out of the vehicle, walking toward the chateau entrance and disappearing inside while leaving the engine running. The guard on Dunham's left lit one of the Lucky Strikes and stared out the window. The guard on his right leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes. Neither one was watching Dunham anymore. He reached under his jacket, pulled the Colt from its holster, turned to his right and shot the guard in the head at point-blank range. The guard on his left started to turn, and Dunham shot him twice in the chest. Then he kicked open the door, jumped out of the Kubelwagen, and ran for the tree line 300 yards to the north. Dunham ran as fast as he could. Behind him, he heard shouting from the chateau, followed by gunfire. Bullets snapped past his head and kicked up frozen dirt at his feet. He did not look back. He reached the tree line and kept running, crashing through bare branches and frozen underbrush. The Germans fired for another 30 seconds before stopping. They were not pursuing him, as they had prisoners to guard and a command post to secure. One escaped American was not worth a squad-level manhunt. However, Dunham was now alone in German-held territory, with no map, no compass, no food, and a pistol with 4 rounds remaining. The wound on his back had reopened during the run, and he could feel blood soaking through his uniform again. His feet were already numb from frostbite after 13 hours in the sauerkraut barrel. The temperature was 9 degrees Fahrenheit and dropping. He was 30 miles behind enemy lines, with no clear route back to American positions. He moved west, as that was the only direction that made sense. West toward the front, west toward the sound of artillery, west toward anything that was not German.